For John Bolton, Mark Levin, and a group of other neoconservatives, bombing the Iranian nuclear program into the Stone Age wasn't enough. They want boots on the ground. They want a ground war. I mean, it's not like their kids are going to be fighting in it or anything.
All right, with us now is John Bolton, President Trump's former national security advisor, a former U.S. ambassador to the UN. Ambassador Bolton, nice to see you. President Trump, late last night, floated the idea of regime change in Iran. How do you feel about regime change as a U.S. goal?
First off, why is anybody asking John Bolton for his opinion on anything at this point?
Well, I think it should be America's declared policy. The regime itself is the problem here. It has been all along, both through its nuclear program, its ballistic missile program, its support for terrorist groups in the Middle East, around the world. This regime's been in power 46 years. It will not change its behavior. So
what John is trying to do here is frame Iran as this problem that somehow we're supposed to go in and solve. He says, it's not just the nuclear situation. Oh, well, I'm sorry. I thought that's what it was. No, it's the fact that Iran itself exists, that the regime exists. We are certainly not going to defend the imams and those guys in power there and what they do in their oppressive government. All right. We are against that in every single way. But there are so many regimes around the world that are horribly oppressive, that are terrible. And you know what? We can't go into each one. But why are we interested in going into this giant country of almost 100 million people? Okay? We're going to solve that? I don't think so. You saw what happened to Iraq. It was a massive disaster. And people like John Bolton were behind all of that stuff. How many of our soldiers died because he wanted regime change? He and his folks wanted regime change in Baghdad. How many of our soldiers came back from that war and took their own lives and are still taking their own lives? Because guys like him think that they're moving pieces around a global chessboard. No, John, you may not.
Only foundation for long-term peace and security in the Middle East is to overthrow the Ayatollahs.
Long-term peace in the Middle East. Yes, okay. So let's see. Sending U.S. troops in, which is what John wants, okay, would basically create a situation where, okay, let's say we depose the Ayatollahs, who we have obviously no love for. They are against everything that we against crony capitalism stand for, okay? But let's say we go in there. All right. You think that the lesson from Iraq is you don't mess around in these places. It's like these people forgot the fundamental tenets of warfare. Okay. They talk a good game, but it's like they never read the Art of War by Sun Tzu. All right. You don't go in there and you don't come in and occupy a country like Iran. It's full of mountains. It's highly ethnically diverse. There are people who hate each other's guts. You take out the Ayatollahs, what happens? Chaos most likely erupts across the country. That's not good for peace in the Middle East, and John Bolton knows it. The truth is, he wants the chaos in Iran. Okay? He wants the chaos.
So you think that regime change should be stated, explicit U.S. policy? You, among other things, are an accomplished lawyer, a constitutional lawyer. Where would the authority come?
Okay, I just noticed that in the background, John's got a chess set, set up for the cameras. The arrogance of this guy. He doesn't care about your sons and daughters at all. They are at best pawns. Their lives mean little to folks like John Bolton. How dare he?
For regime change, if that became the United States goal?
The United States has inherent authority to defend itself.
See what he's trying to do here? So now it's Iran represents an existential threat to the United States. You're going to hear a lot more of that, I think. I think Ted Cruz basically tried to make a similar case, which fell on deaf ears, all right? Iran is not an existential threat to the United States. Iran potentially with a nuclear weapon could have been an existential threat to Israel. All right. But John is making the case that we're supposed to go in and eradicate this regime, this horrible regime, because somehow it's a threat to us. It is not. Guess what? There are plenty of countries that are legitimate threats to us. The Chinese, arguably the Russians in a lot of respects. Okay. Iran doesn't have intercontinental ballistic missiles. Okay. Iran doesn't have submarines that can park off of our shores and lob, nuclear weapons at us. Okay. It constitutes a constant problem for folks in Tel Aviv, for whom we care. Like, we are generally friends of Israel, but it is not our job to go in and institute regime change, especially after now a quarter century of failure from people like John Bolton. The neoconservatives have hurt this country so deeply since 2011. How dare he come on and say that our children should go fight in Tehran or wherever, or God knows where it would lead. How dare he?
And if you need further proof of that, the UN Charter, Article 51, guarantees to every member state, and I quote, the inherent right of individual and collective self-defense.
Think about how crazy that statement just was, where he's trying to put together some case for why we're legally allowed to go into Iran and topple the regime. Because under the UN Charter, which apparently we're supposed to pay attention to for some reason, a country has a right to its self-defense. But we're going into Iran.
Is an American decision what's in our self-interest, not controlled by the United Nations or anybody else. I think, as I said earlier, the president's done exactly the right thing here. Now the logic of protecting American interest, Israel, our Gulf Arab allies, is to work with the opposition in Iran and remove the Ayatollahs. This does not mean American boots on the ground. It's simple-minded
nonsense. John Bolton knows that it means boots on the ground. At the very least, it means American advisors, our military on the ground, working with the opposition in a civil war that for some reason we're supposed to be entangled in because of the interests of our allies. I thought he was making the case that, it was an existential interest, or it was in our interest because Iran was an existential threat to us, not our allies. Interesting.
When people say inevitably we're going to be engaged in a larger war, there are a lot of ways to achieve regime change, and we ought to be actively thinking about what the best way to do it is.
John wants you to think that, now our intelligence community is just thinking about regime change. Now we should start thinking. I got news for you. Our intelligence community is full of a lot of really smart folks, okay? And they've been thinking about taking out the Ayatollahs for a long time. So let's not pretend like this is some kind of new thing. What he wants is chaos in Iran. He will swear, I believe, probably, that is absolutely not what he wants. But chaos in Iran is very advantageous for folks like him, folks who adhere to the neoconservative philosophy of American empire.
So aside from boots on the ground, but military strikes are still military action. And I'm not arguing whether or not it is a worthy goal. I'm just asking if regime change is a stated goal. And I understand self-defense is part of international law, but U.S. law, I think, would seem to suggest that removing a regime in a country would be an act of war, either.
Well, what do you know? We agree with the talking heads on CNN for once.
Needing a constitution, either based on your constitutional authority or the War Powers Resolution. Do you think the president has the authority to conduct new military strikes for the purpose of regime change?
Of course. Look,
This is outrageous. He says, of course, as if this is self-evident. This is nuts.
The Commander-in-Chief authority in Article 2 expressly gives the president enormous power to deal with threats to the United States around the world. And let's look at
Threats to the United States, not our allies, not our friends, threats to the United States. And Iran, generally speaking, has not been a threat to the United States. It is an enemy of the United States, but that's very different than a threat to the United States.
a little history. In 1798, John Adams fought what was called the quasi-war against France, a naval war. No declaration of war, went on for over 2 years. Shortly thereafter, his arch political enemy, Thomas Jefferson, directed American forces to begin war against the Barbary pirates in what is today Libya. Again, no declaration of war. It went on for 3 or 4 years. There was a subsequent outbreak of war there. Again, no declaration of war.
Okay, John. Well, first, we're talking about existential risks to the United States in those instances. All right. But let's talk about history. Let's talk about recent history. Let's talk about how you and your whole school of international relations, the neoconservatives, have undermined the fundamental values of this country. All right. The fact that this country has suffered under leadership from people like you, waging wars in the name of empire, even though we were founded as an anti-colonial power. Now, that's another debate. But what is not up for debate is the fact that you guys failed over and over and over again my entire adult life, and you have no business preaching to us about what we should do in Iran.
So this is important constitutional history, deeply embedded early in our history. 2 presidents who had experience, who were the 2 of the leaders of the revolution, and participated directly and indirectly in drafting the Constitution, took America to war, and in 2 very different circumstances. And nobody said, "Where's the declaration of war?" A declaration of war says Congress declares that a state of war exists between the United States and X. So here's a question for you. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941, Congress responded to President Roosevelt's request and declared war. I think it was the next day or the day after, let's say December the 8th. When did World War II begin for the United States? Pearl Harbor attack or declaration of war by Congress? It's perfectly obvious it began with the Japanese attack. That's the reality. People say, well, what's Congress's role in this? Appropriating funds if Congress doesn't like what Trump is doing.
Look, we actually think the executive has some authority here in limited situations, all right? But waging war, the fact that he's so dismissive of the Congress declaring war, like one of the safeguards of the people to make sure that people like him don't end up hurting this country, again, is completely nuts. And the fact that he thinks he has some moral foundation on which to stand is just bonkers.
Doing in Iran, let them withhold funds.
As I told our audience, this is something you have thought about and written about extensively, not just recently, but for decades and decades. So I wanted you to lay out your...
Yes. Watch as the CNN guy has to genuflect before John Bolton. For some reason, we are to pay attention to you, Mr. Mustache.
Case right there. What do you think the most likely Iranian response is at this moment to the U.S. strikes?
Well, I don't think it's possible to predict. I think, in fact, the question about how to respond to the United States is one of the elements that's destabilizing, potentially destabilizing to the regime, because there's going to be extensive disagreement, I believe, among top military commanders, at least the ones that are left in Iran, among some of the Ayatollahs about how to do it. And I think there probably are a few sensible people in Tehran who are saying, you know, since Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th, 2023, we've faced one military adversary, and it's kicking our butt. It has pummeled Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. The Assad regime in Syria has fallen, we are seeing our nuclear program and our ballistic missile program turned into ashes. Against one military opponent, we're not doing very well. So, do we want to attack American forces, American civilian locations, or other assets in the Middle East and bring a second military adversary, the largest military power in the world, against us? I think that's a harder decision than some may think. And that's how you can.
We actually generally agree with John here. So, what he's basically saying is that the rational response for the Iranian regime is to chill out. So, ceasefire. We're for ceasefires, but it seems like the neoconservatives want war regardless.
The truth, too. So, we have a ceasefire. I hate this word ceasefire. I really do. The president hated it a few days ago, too.
Interesting, because it seems like he's for a ceasefire. I hate to say this, because generally speaking, I'm a pretty big fan of Israel in many, many respects. But it feels like the Israelis and the neoconservatives in this country are trying to force us into a war that is not in our interests. We need to stay out of Iran. All right. We need to remember the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan and a million other smaller conflicts that we've gotten involved in that just drag us in and suck our tax dollars and kill our sons and daughters. Enough of this.